I'd like to begin by saying that I am not a trained sinologist, or have I a PhD in any aspect of Asian art. And I think that's important to understand, that I'm coming from the point of view of an artist and critic and what I call a semi-scholar. I say semi-scholar because I do not speak Chinese, and I do not know Mandarin, Cantonese, or Shanghai dialect. But I'm going to attempt to make some forays into the art of ink in China, which I have done for several years now, because it's something that I love and is something that I respect, and I think it needs more attention in New York. My PhD is actually in modernism, and that was after I got my MFA. And I wrote the first dissertation in the United States on conceptual art. After a number of years, I abandoned that because I discovered that the idea of the concept in art was much more viable in China than it was in the United States, in that there's no separation between concept and form in China. It's all one. And that had a great appeal to me in terms of an intellectual foray that I wanted to explore, and I've explored it ever since. So that's how I made my way from one extreme to what might seem to be another, although it's really not. I was influenced early on by the writings of Edmund Husserl, the phenomenologist, by the remarkable books of Martin Buber, and by the Japanese writer Daisetsu Suzuki and Edward Conze. Edward Conze wrote a great deal on China, particularly Chinese Buddhism, which had a remarkable impact on me early on. I want to say that during the Vietnam War, I was a conscientious objector, meaning I had to perform 2 years of alternative service. Upon completion of that, I was invited by an astrophysicist from Denmark, who was actually finishing up at Harvard, to come to Copenhagen and have a studio for a few months where I could work. That was at the beginning of my career, extremely valuable time in my life. I returned from there 4.5 months later in 1971 to the Boston area, and I got a job mopping floors at a design studio in the downtown area of Boston. And I was going to museums constantly when I wasn't mopping floors, because there's the Fogg Museum, of course, at Harvard, and there is the wonderful Museum of Fine Arts in Boston that has a spectacular Asian collection. Particularly the scrolls of China and Japan are just magnificent, and I was encouraged to go there by a painter that I was close to at the time by the name of John McLaughlin, who I believe has an exhibition right now at Van Doren Waxter. Anyway, one day I saw in the bookstore a bound series of facsimiles, and it was on sale from $75 to $25, and I didn't have $25. So I asked the clerk, there were only 3 left, and I said, I would like this because it traces the Yuan dynasty through the Ming dynasty of all these remarkable scrolls, and many of them were in the collection at the Museum of Fine Arts, which I had seen in the flesh, and I wanted to have this book. And so a month later, I came back with my $25, and I bought the book. That was in 1971, and that was the beginning of my journey into Chinese art. Now, I say rethinking contemporary Chinese art, ink art, because, as you know, there has been some discussion, and I think an important show here in New York 2.5 years ago at the Met, in which this was introduced more or less to the New York audience for the first time. And I think that it got mixed reviews. It did get mixed reviews. I was very, very interested in this show and went there several times and met the curator, and we talked on numerous occasions regarding the subject matter of this very important show. Now, what I'm going to present this evening are Chinese artists, some of them are in the audience, who I have gotten to know over the years and spoken with at length in terms of the subject, in other words, in terms of what they do. And I have to say that of all the times I have been to China and other countries in Asia and East Asia, that I have the rather unusual experience of talking with these artists who are not so concerned about pushing their careers, which is, I think, something that other people have had a very different point of view with, but in my case, that was never true. Rather, we spent hours talking about art, ink, history, and philosophy, and we drank delicious tea. The tea in China is wonderful. And it was possible, I felt, for myself to live the life of art in China, perhaps even more than New York today. I remember 45 years ago, when I first came to New York, I could live the life of art. It's very, very difficult to live that life today because Americans are continually confusing the quality of life with materialism. And this has crept into the art world and become very problematic. I suppose one could say to some extent that's true in China, but perhaps just not as obvious to me there as it is here. But it's certainly a trend. There's no question about that. I'm going to begin with the artist Dai Guanyu. Dai Guanyu. Dai Guanyu is one of the survivors from the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. By that I mean that he was there and he was threatened, like a number of other people were threatened, by the tanks, by the guns, by the legions of soldiers that were there to protect their government from this estrangement that was threatening them. And I have to say that his performances have consistently dealt with ink, but in a way that is more or less resistance, confrontational, but very indirect, which is very typical of much of the Chinese art, particularly in the area of ink art. And I have to say that my experience with Dai, as we have talked, is that he mixes both Tao, which is of course close to nature, with Confucius, which of course is the basis of metaphysics in China. That I think he felt after the Tiananmen Square massacre that it was time to return to that which is known, or that which is essential. Ink runs in the veins of the Chinese. This is my point, that it's very symbolic, very important, and therefore the calligrapher and the ink artist traditionally in China has played a very important role in terms of the stature, the culture, the respect that the Chinese have for their enlightened past. You're looking at a piece called Landscape, and landscape in Chinese, sanchu, and this is done under the ink, the ice, as you can see, ink and ice. This is a reminder of what is essential in China. In other words, we have the yin-yang, which is interpreted often by Westerners as male and female, but it's also creation and destruction, borrowed probably from the Indians. But the other point is that there is also, in addition to yin-yang, there is the mountain and the sea. And when you put the mountain and the sea together, you get that similar kind of force of meaning in terms of what the universe is and what the human being is and perhaps what it means to be Chinese. So this is a very important work for Dai Guanyu at this particular stage in his career, which was in the early 90s, shortly after Tiananmen Square. I want to show one more of his, which is the expanding borderline of China, which of course is the ink running out from the interior. As the ink runs out, it seems that the space of the continent of China, or the country within the continent of East Asia, is diminishing. And it is a very ambiguous statement, but a very interesting one, again, working with ink. Whoops, sorry. Okay, in a way I resisted showing this, this image because it's become almost cliche at this point, but it's such a beautiful work that it's difficult to resist. And we're looking at the book From the Sky by Chu Bing. And Chu Bing, as some of you know, for a number of years, in addition to being an artist, partially living in New York, in Brooklyn, and working there, and partially living in Beijing, that for 6 years he was the vice president of the CAFA, which is the Chinese Art Institute of some renown. There are a couple people here that are very connected to that, as a matter of fact, which I'm delighted to have them in the audience. He's interested in the problem of language and what happens in the language when there is cultural change, or when there is a time of revolution that is pervasive. In other words, what happens to the language? It begins to dissipate, it begins to deconstruct. And in the case of this work, these are all fake Chinese ideograms. They're not real, and each one is unique. So we have more than 700 of these ideograms, which are the word pictures in China, that make up this book From the Sky. And it's really about the time. Again, it was completed over a 6-year period in 1991. So that's through the time of Tiananmen Square, and I can't emphasize that enough, as having a remarkable impact upon China, both perhaps positive and for sure negative. But the point is, the artists have sublimated that notion of that disaster, sublimated in the Freudian sense, although I dislike using Western terms to talk about Asia. But nonetheless, I see the sublimation as the taking of a conflict and transforming it into the qi, the energy that is going to transform what they do, how they think, how they live, and how they feel. And the responsibility is taken by the artists to do that, artists like Chu Bing. Now, oops. This is a work that I saw quite early on. I believe I saw it around the time that it was done, if I'm not mistaken, oddly enough, in New York at a very small gallery that was, I think, an alternative space of some sort. But anyway, I was completely thrown by it because I didn't understand what was going on. But the title is interesting, A Case Study of Transference, and I think it had a lot to do with the relationship between China and the United States at that time. If you look closely, if you can see from the back of the room, the markings on each pig, one of them is English and the other is Chinese. But if you look at the English, the words make no sense whatsoever. The words themselves make no sense. And if you know Chinese, the ideograms, as in the book From the Sky, don't make any sense either. So there is this ongoing notion of this deconstruction of language at a time of chaos and inevitable change that is happening in relation to this work. I was going to make what I feel is a comparison, this idea of coming up with a unique non-character, in other words, a character that does not have meaning, is not unlike Bruce Naumann's piece called Wall Floor Positions from 1969. It's a videotape I don't know how many of you have seen it. If you haven't, you will see it later this year when Bruce has his next retrospective, I think his second retrospective at MoMA. But the point is that during the course of an hour, he changes his position in relation to the wall and floor 240 times, which means that every 15 seconds, he's got to be thinking about the next change that he has not already done. Do you follow what I'm saying? Okay? Now, he can't stick to the wall because he'll fall, and it's impossible. But he can stick to the floor, and he can use the wall. But the point is that the idea of an artist like Chu Bing doing an unknown character or an unmeaning character without copying it a second time is extraordinary in terms of the focus, in terms of the concentration, in terms of the pursuit of a meaning beyond a meaning in relation to this notion of deconstruction. And I thought that that was, for me at least, an interesting kind of comparison. Okay, they are copulating, obviously, as you've noticed, and it's interesting that many of the Chinese thought that the pigs would be prudent and wait until the audience left before they copulated. But of course, it was only the audience that was prudent, not the pigs, which got very involved in this. And some people were, I think, mildly horrified, but others more or less tried to make sense of what it was in terms of a statement by this artist that was already well known from his book From the Sky. Just two more quickly. This is a work that I've always lived called Living Word, and it's the ideograms gradually going abstract and eventually changing into birds. It's a beautiful piece that I saw, I believe, in Shanghai, and that would have been it. No, I wouldn't have seen it in Shanghai because it was too late. But anyway, I saw it somewhere. And I loved this piece. And here is another one that perhaps some of you saw because it was here in New York. It's the Phoenix at the St. John the Divine, which has traveled around the world. And all of this was made from found objects that had been used, okay, that were in a state of decay. They were detritus. And he made this, he transformed it again. He took the conflict and he transformed it into this extraordinary phoenix. Now, of course, the phoenix is a mythological bird, but it's very close to the idealism that China strives for upon occasion, okay? And therefore, it is the kind of compatriot of the dragon and has a great deal of meaning. Now, I would maintain, and I'm going to bring this theme up over the course of my remarks this evening, is that there is the embodiment of the brush within the mind with these artists. Just as Chu Bing can use the brush in this remarkable way, in terms of these ideograms that I have spoken about, these non-ideograms, okay? The point is that the brush is in the mind. The ink is in the mind. This is the basis of the work. They don't need a text to explain this work. Okay, one more. This is at ground level. You can see how remarkable this appears, and I can tell you it was remarkable, and it carried a great deal of emotion, which is something, of course, that we can find in the best Chinese art. Okay. This woman's name is Bingji, and Bingji is also interested in the extension of the brush as mind and as body to some degree. She is interested in the distance from the brush in relation to what is being delivered. And how did we get there? You know, I'm going to need some help with this because I don't know what this image is and where it came from. I think we're at about number 7.
7.
After that, two more. Okay, thank you. That's good.
I don't see it.
Yeah, and I wanted to go to the next one, which Thanks very much.
Sure.
Yeah, I
Okay,
appreciate
you're
it.
not seeing it right now.
Sorry, oh,
So let me just make it sure this. There you go.
okay. Sorry about that. I get talking and I forget about the computer. Anyway, the point is that Binji, whose exhibition I saw in Beijing a number of years ago and wrote about it, is, I think, an extraordinary artist in many ways, just in terms of her use of ink when she's doing straight work, that is, on Chuen paper. And it's, she uses the soaking of the ink as well as the brush, which a number of artists are working with. I'm going to show you a couple more who do this, but she also has another idea which I think is extraordinary, and she's walking on sailcloth, the kind of canvas that's used in sailboats and so forth. And the ink that has dropped on the sailcloth has come from helicopters, and I will show you what this is before the first dropping of the ink has occurred here. Here is the helicopter above dropping a bag of ink, and here it is in the process of spattering the ink on the surface. And of course, she will modulate this, as you saw in that original slide. I originally was going to show you a short 2-minute film of this, because it's really great to see this. It's amazing. Okay, and here's the way it's shown. So the concavity allows you to get into it in terms of a certain kind of depth of perception, and it's also very large, so you're engulfed by it as well as embodied by it. Here's another example of one of these large-scale works. And here she is wrapping it around herself with one of these on the back wall. The reception to this work has been quite extraordinary, because I think that the Chinese audience that is interested in this is really interested in how new it is and how vital it might be. And she is very serious as an artist. She is not trying to shock the audience or to do something for the sake of doing it. She really has an idea, and she feels this idea very strongly in terms of the ink coming from the sky onto the, it's not Chuen in this case, it's the sailcloth, but nonetheless, it could be Chuen, which is the Chinese paper. Okay, Gu Wenda, one of the earliest Chinese artists that I met in New York back in, as a matter of fact, 89. I was with him in Poland when he did his first hairpiece, and he had collected hair from people of different races, ethnic backgrounds from around the world, and mixed it together and did an installation. This was in, actually it was in 1993, but the date that is given is 94, 95, because it was shown elsewhere after its original showing in the town of Wich, which is in Poland. There was an artist group of 126 artists coming from various places in the world, including, I think, Saul LeWitt, among others. It was quite an event organized by somebody named Richard Vashko, who is a very special guy, an artist and a curator, who got the Greenberger Award this past year. This is one of his installations that was shown. I remember seeing a version of this in the Gwangju Biennial, and that would have been back, well, I don't have the date on this, but I think it would be back in the mid-90s. No, it would be later than that, the late 90s. It would be around 2000, actually. 2000, yes. These are also made-up characters, different, as you can see, from the ideograms of Xu Bing, because he's dealing with characters that are removed from Chinese as well as Chinese. This is his bauble. It's got a great deal of attention at the San Francisco MoMA. It's a site-specific work. I've become quite familiar with his work, or I did at one time, because a lot of these new ideas that were coming in to the art world from China were of great interest to me, and he was in New York, and I could have easy access to him. Okay, Zheng Lijian. Lijian is here in the audience with us tonight. I'm very happy about that. I'm interested in how he manages to create this sense of turbulence and this state of being within this turbulence. Let me show you exactly what I'm referring to. This was done in 1999 when he first came to the United States from China, and this one is much more recent. In one of our conversations, I asked him, because he was also at Tiananmen Square, I said, are you protesting with this paint? Is this a protest? And his response to me was, it's not a protest, but it's a state of being. It's how I feel. It's the excitement of how I feel that this change is going on. Now, the way he said it was not so much in terms of politics, the way we might take it from the Western point of view or from the American point of view. It wasn't a political point that he was making. He wasn't excited that one side was against another. Not that at all. It was how he generated the energy within himself and how he used that energy in terms of the application to ink, as we see here. This is an extraordinary work called Huge Explosion, Binding the Lost Souls. As you can tell, this is the rubble from the wall of China. And here's a close-up of that. And again, I would like to say, relative to this notion of the brush being an embodiment of thought, this is exactly what it is in relation to this work. I'm not sure that a text is necessary here in order to feel the emotion of what this work is about, particularly within the historical time that it is being done. Lin Jianhui is an artist who I've met on several occasions, most recently at a symposium out in Chicago. He's interested in doing the unforgivable, that is, combining calligraphy with painting as one thing. Now, we know traditionally, going back to the Tang Dynasty, of course, and before, but certainly it was nurtured during the Tang Dynasty in Xian. And at that time, calligraphy would be the poem on the landscape, but there would be the poem and the landscape. In the case of Lan, we have not the separation between the two, but the collision between the two. It's as much calligraphy as it is painting. And I think this would be a grand example from 2015. It happens to be a recent work which deals with that collision between calligraphy and painting. Traditionally, they are not considered the same in terms of Chinese art.
What's the size of that?
Very large. It's about 16, 18 feet across. It's a good question. Very large. And I would say that most of these are very large. They're not easel scale paintings. And this, by the way, this is on Xuan paper. This is not on canvas. By the way, it's interesting, just as a side note, that this paper, which is made from mulberry and elm, is it can endure as long as 1,000 years, and that has proven to be the case by some conservators in China. Whereas canvas has only been around for 700 years. We don't know how long that can hold up, although the conservation techniques, of course, have improved enormously just over the last 50 years in order to preserve things like Pollock's painting, for example, which, you know, the way the mixing went on in those days, or Rauschenberg, for example, but now they can be preserved. But the Xuan paper, what I'm trying to emphasize is, sure, there were copies done in the Ming Dynasty of the Northern Sung period. The Northern Sung period is in the 10th century, okay? The Ming Dynasty, we're talking about the 15th, 16th century, 14th, 15th, 16th. And those courtier artists, they understood perfectly the painting that was being done in the Northern Song, which is considered the greatest painting in China, by the way. It would be like the High Renaissance in the West. And they could copy it, and they could copy it precisely, but you could always tell the academic veneer of a Ming Dynasty painting that is trying to copy the Song Dynasty. Even though they could copy it, there was still this kind of distance that didn't have the spirit as it was understood. The spirit. Linjian, what is the spirit, the name, the Chinese name that I'm looking for in calligraphy? Linjian. What is the word? Zheng. Okay. This is what to get the chop, which is the seal of approval, it has to have that. Without that, there is no chop, okay? Anyway. Okay, Zheng Chongbing, who has shown and lectured in New York and is now in Beijing having, I think, a remarkable show. He is getting a great deal of attention because he is supremely aware of his past in terms of traditional ink, but he is also very cultivated, and I say cultivated because he's taken American ideas in painting and he's moved them into a Chinese vocabulary, as we see in this. And keep in mind that the diagonal, it's very difficult to find one of those in the history of Chinese painting, but here they are highly emphasized, and of course they begin with constructivism, and many of the groups that followed that point of view. And he is completely aware of this history, but at the same time he is free of that history. Or I should say free within that history is what I'm trying to say in terms of Zheng Chongbing. So the Western influence is within the Eastern process. And here we have, I think, an extraordinary work of his using, again, the diagonal. And this is his recent show that opened about 2 weeks ago, which I was able to get photographs of from the ink studio in Beijing. Some of these, as you can see, are quite large. And this is a video. He has done several videos using ink. And this is to suggest that he is moving into a contemporary medium, a medium of the 21st century in terms of ink. And he goes back and forth between the embodiment of the history and the representation, not the representation, but the presentation of ink as a soluble material that has significance, deep cultural significance. Okay, Lin Yan, who is here with us, with her husband, Wei Jia. I've shown both of these artists on numerous occasions, and that's not what how did I get that? Okay, I think I may need help again. Is there help back there? We can just move it quickly forward.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. That's good. None of it, we need to project it.
How do you?
You know, I don't use PC, I use Mac, and therefore the buttons are not familiar to me, so. Okay, we've got to go back, go back, go back, go back, go back, okay. Go back, go back. Okay, that's good, thank you. Yeah, right, okay. All right. This is Chuan paper, And this is an exhibition of 4 works that were done about 8 years, no, longer than that, 10 years ago. And you can see that there is casting of bricks and other objects in some of these. And what interested me when I first saw the work of Lin Yan is how she was using the paper as sculpture, essentially, and how she was casting with the paper, and how she was using the ink as a kind of totality within the surface to give a kind of resonance that spoke of her emotion in relation to that particular time, the particular time that she was working, which is both social and personal from her point of view. Here's a close-up, which I think is quite striking. And this work I saw initially with Lin Yan in Beijing. And what we're seeing is the paper and the saturation with ink. And it's called New York, Beijing, here, there. And one, not to be too literal, but one could see this as a kind of pollution, of course, which is a major threat now, particularly in Beijing. It's often talked about. And this is the city where she grew up in, and she remembers riding her bicycle as a young person, and remembering the blue skies, okay, and the sunny days, which are difficult to find now in Beijing, with all the industry and the automobiles and so forth, which have literally encroached on that city in very recent times. So it's a big change, and this becomes a statement, a very interesting statement in relation to that. Here is a detail. You can see you can see the detail within the detail. In other words, the ink saturation is very involved in terms of how she plays with it and overlays it and so forth. This work I saw in Belgium, in Brussels actually. It's called Sky, and it's just the hanging Chuan paper, which is just extraordinary to see, particularly, I believe, no, this is not the one that was in the house where I saw it. This is in another space. But it's an extraordinary feeling to encounter this because the paper is never really still. As you pass by, it is moving with you. And yet there's a kind of lightness, but there's a kind of density at the same time, which suggests the stretch of emotional feelings that come into the work. This is a work that she did in the Flatiron Building in this gallery. I think Cynthia McGuinness, I believe is her name, used to do exhibitions there, and one of these was by Lin Yan. And I think that in this case we have the feeling of the qi, which is the energy of the, it's not a tiger, it's a leopard, I believe. Or cheetah? Cheetah, that's it, right. And again, this is painted on the Chuan paper, and it is presented almost like a sculpture, but in fact it is a painting on paper. Okay, Shen Chen is also with us. I'm interested in his brushwork. I'm interested in the intricacy of his brushwork. He uses very, very flat brushes, which are not what are commonly used in China, but he uses them here. And with those flat brushes, he is able to move back and forth in a very systematic way, so that he's going from dark to light and light to dark. But these canvases are on the floor. In other words, he never sees them vertically on a wall until the painting is complete. All the work is done on the floor, and it stays on the floor until it is completed. Now, from my point of view, I think that Shen is dealing both with the romance of Taoism and the analysis of Confucius, in a way. I think that both are present, and in a way that makes sense if you look at what was happening, for example, during the Tang Dynasty, a period of great poetry, by the way, and great elegance in the courts. I think much more credible in many ways than the Ming Dynasty. And you have this combination of, you don't notice perhaps the romance so much in the work as you do the analysis when it's on the floor, because it's so particular in terms of how he's moving, how he's pushing the paint back and forth, pushing it to just the right place, pushing it, pulling it, pushing it, pulling it, going back and forth. And then eventually, when the completion happens, then we see it from an entirely different perspective, a vertical perspective as opposed to a lateral one. Now, Shen and I have spoken often about this, and he was at one time very much dedicated to ink painting, and he felt that at a certain point that he wanted to move the process of ink painting and Shuen paper into acrylic and canvas. That he felt that, again, a very Chinese point, that the idea or the concept is what could carry over, okay? In other words, he could treat the paint and the surface the way he treated the Chuen paper and the brush, okay? That he could give it a new semblance, okay? And this is precisely what he has done. Some of these works are quite striking, as you can see. He's also got some triptychs that are amazing. One of them was shown recently. Where did I see it? I think it was in Miami, at Art Miami, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was shown by Nanhai Gallery in San Francisco. Okay, Youngji Kong. Youngji Kong is an amazing artist to listen to in terms of how he proclamates what he does as an artist and the discouraging years that he had when people simply didn't get what he was doing. Now, I would say there's also a great deal of Taoism in his work. Let's turn to a work right here. This is called 100 Layers of Ink Box, and this is indeed 100 layers of saturated ink, okay? Now, I would say that coming from the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, that the darker the pour, the more light. In other words, the more darkness you put on it, the more the light will bounce off of it. And again, it's the abandonment of the material brush in favor of the, for a better word or a better phrase, embodied brush, okay? He abandons the material brush to regain the source. And the source, in the case of Youngji Kong, is emptiness. This is what he strives for. Now, I think it's very hard to understand that, maybe from a Western point of view, that all this work, all this time, all this effort, all these years go into making emptiness. How is that possible? Well, you know, I think of emptiness as nature. If you are really in a place where nature abounds, and that's what is there, and you are there with it, it's emptiness. It's beautiful, but it's emptiness. Okay? And I think to get to that state of mind, that, for a better word, for a more Western word, a natural state of mind, okay, is really something. This is emptiness. And it takes a lot of work and effort and commitment and focus and concentration to get to emptiness. It's brilliant, I think. I am very taken by this work. We'll talk about that slightly a little more. This work was in the Metropolitan, actually, the show that Mike Hearn did. And again, this is what I was saying about the light. The phrase that in translation from the Tao Te Ching is, there is no darkness without light, there is no light without darkness. Okay? In other words, it's one thing. Okay? It's like the mountains and the sea in terms of what we were looking at in the landscape. There is no difference, in a sense. They are part of the same, and they will always be part of the same. Okay, this artist is considered one of the premier calligraphers in China. His name is Wang Dongling. I have to say that Wang is a great person. He's now, I think, 72 or 3. I think Wong, in many ways, is closest to the Western idea, but he always maintains an Eastern sensibility. It's almost like he is hiding the Western approach, but it's not really even an approach. It's just learning that he achieved on a very high level when he came to the United States in the 1990s. And I forgot the exact circumstances in terms of how he got here, but they were interesting, and he ended up staying here quite a bit longer than he intended to at the beginning. And he told me that his breakthrough occurred in Berkeley when he met a student who was in his class who said something to him. He didn't tell me what the student said, but it was important enough so that it changed his whole position in terms of the relationship of calligraphy to painting, similar to the idea we were talking about earlier, but I think on a more deep level. He's deeply grounded in his own tradition. He lives in Hangzhou. He is a premier calligrapher. He is an amazing performer, because what you see that he's standing on here, and he always wears these red socks, by the way, with this red sweater. He does all of this in about a half an hour. It's unbelievable. And it's always, the speed never changes. It's always the same time. I don't know how he can do this. He never is slower, he never is faster. He establishes the momentum at what he wants from the beginning, from the first ideogram, and goes all the way through. But he's still doing this, and he's in his 70s, and he continues to do it. And I think this is it's either a poem or a section from the Tao Te Ching, which I believe is what we're seeing here. Okay? Now, I want to switch gears a little bit here. This is a photograph I took of, this is definitely the Tao Te Ching. This is another place, another time. This was at the Met in February of 2014, longer than I thought. Anyway, the point is that he is finishing the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching. And I'm very taken by that because I think they're beautiful, and I think that he is so remarkable in terms of his poise and demeanor as an artist, in terms of performing, something that should maybe come over here. Okay, this reminds me of that famous Pollock, in which he's in front of his number 32 in his barn in the Hamptons. Here we're getting a large ideograph, but this is different from what's behind him, because these are this is a text that he is, well, actually this is a made-up text, okay? And what he's doing is he begins with an ideogram that has meaning, and then he changes it so the meaning is completely changed to no meaning, okay? Now, speaking of that, here he is, Jackson Pollock. Now, I'm going to talk about this because it's crept into China now, and I understand in the universities like Kafa and Hanju, those are the two major academies in China, that in fact Pollock is coming into the lectures. And I thought, what? How is it possible that Pollock can come into the lectures in China? Well, they're interested in works like this, okay? I don't know how many of you know where this is. Any of you? It's not in the United States. It's in the Kunstsammlung in Dusseldorf, okay? If you want to see it, you got to go there unless there's another retrospective. But anyway, this is an extraordinary painting by Pollock, I think, in the sense that I think it really captures what he means to a very high level, okay? And at the same time, it has that appearance, perhaps, of something that is Chinese. Now, before I make any conclusive remarks about this, I want to go through others, like Franz Klein, for example. And there was some talk back in the days when he was making these, the days being the 1950s, that they were close to Japanese calligraphy, because at that time there was an awareness of Japan and an awareness of some of the culture of Japan. But of course, Franz never committed to that. He never believed that according to what he said in interviews and statements, that he never believed that he was doing what the Japanese were trying to do. And I think he was right. I think he was extremely accurate in making that comment. Now, I'm showing you this, which is also Franz Klein, and I'm showing you this, which is Wang Dongling. Okay? Now, let's, oh God, I got it right without, this is great. This is a big accomplishment. Okay, so here is Franz Klein, and here is Wang Dongling. Now, Wang Dongling, I mean, obviously, you can feel the difference. You can possibly see the difference. I don't know. But the point is that this is where Wang Dongling is taking the ideogram that has meaning, and then by adding extra strokes or deleting areas of it, that he creates non-meaning. Okay? So it's a little different than what we saw with Xu Bing and with Gu Wenda, in the sense that there is meaning beneath the non-meaning. Okay? And he wants the ideograph to stand on its own, to have its own presence, because he feels that with the new buildings that are going up in China, that art of this level has to be on a larger scale in order to be part of that new arena, that new sensibility that's coming into architecture, which is not coming in, it's there, but is continuing to evolve. And he wants to be part of what you see through the glass when you look inside. Okay? And here is Robert Motherwell, an artist who spent most of his career, over 200 of these elegies to the Spanish Republic were made during Motherwell's career. Here is a print that I think describes so accurately his intuition. I mean, how can you not see a kind of Chinese or Japanese point of view in terms of this ink? And I switched to Ad Reinhardt because, you know, I've always felt that Ad Reinhardt could have been an action painter, but he chose no action, which Wu Wei, it's called. And you know, Wu Wei is without motion, without motion. So this is what he's doing, and this is one of his black paintings. You all know what those are. And this is Youngji Kong. Now, this is the guy who does the 100 layers of black paint. And again, you can see how the layers build up, and gradually the light emits from the surface. Now, it has a whole different meaning, is what I'm going to suggest. That, let me put it this way. Given what I said about the mental embodiment of the brush, or the mental embodiment of the ink, this is something that is very much within Chinese art. It has been forever, okay? Americans don't think like that, okay? You don't find Americans paying attention to the brush. They're interested in the surface. They're trying to construct the surface. If you look at de Kooning, for example, that wonderful film that shows him painting, you know, the brush is irrelevant. It's what is happening in the surface. He'll make the mark, and he'll use his knife, palette knife, and then he'll stand back and he'll look at the painting to make sure, you know, that he did the right thing to get the surface right. And I think this is a big difference, because it's very difficult to conceptualize a surface. It's a material object. It's a thing, okay? Whereas with the Chinese, there is this belief that if the mind is right, the brush will be right, and the surface will just happen. That's the point. The surface will just happen. Now, Youngji Kong is in his pores of the surface to get the light from the black, is pouring instead of the brush. But the pour is also the ink which is connected to the brush. Now, another point that I wanted to make about Wendagu, which I completely forgot, is one reason he was collecting the hair is the hair is on the brush. And therefore the ink and the hair are completely reunited in international terms, what he called a global art. Okay? I mean, he called it, other people did too, but as far as I know, he was the first artist who had that idea very early in the game, at least from China. Okay, let's move on to slide Twombly. I think it's kind of obvious what I'm trying to do here. By the way, I think that Twombly was quite inconsistent in terms of the quality from my point of view, but I think that this was a great period when he was doing this work, and that I think you could easily translate this in terms of a Chinese idea, perhaps. But the fact is that there is no character here, and there's no knowledge of the character. It's still the surface that he is dealing with. And Bryce Marden, of course, has been talked about a great deal in terms of his Cold Mountain paintings, which he borrows from the Tang poet Han Shan. Okay? But there are other poets during that period, too, that were more literati in the wilderness, like Tu Fu and Li Po. And I remember spending a summer reading these two poets many, many years ago, actually 18 years ago to be exact. I was fascinated by these Tang poets, and I know that Weijia here reads Tang poets assiduously. And when I introduced him to the director of the Nanhai Gallery, they were both so into Tang Dynasty poems. But anyway, this is what Marden is working with. Now, I have to say, of all the people from the United States, beginning with Pollock, Motherwell, Klein, and so forth, I think that Marden has probably come closest to the idea. But it's a little fake from my point of view, but it's still closer, I think, in terms of the intention than some of the others. And when I say the intention, I'm saying that more in terms of a Husserlian point of view, where he talks about intention as the embodiment of the image. It's sort of like the intentional object is the first computer, okay? In other words, you have it in your mind and you can draw it out at any given time. It's not the way intention is used generally in American art schools, okay? Anyway, I want to show a couple of these because I think that they're not bad. They're not bad. And I think it was an important period in his career. I don't want to talk about Martin. That's not the point of this discourse tonight or my remarks tonight. But I have to say that the Chinese have taken him quite seriously. There was an exhibition at Columbia exactly 20 years ago. Zhang Yaho, I believe, the curator of that show. And there is a chapter that he wrote on the work of, and you know, I was a little much in disbelief, but it was close enough for me to understand where he was coming from. And I think it was just to show that there is this new interest between the Americans and China. Now, I personally think that that interest was somewhere subliminal in Klein and in Pollock. They just didn't know it, okay? Nobody knew anything about China in this country during that period of the 50s, okay? And now we're online, and we know. Or how much do we know? I don't know much, but I know enough to say that I think that some of the people that I have shown you tonight are worth thinking about more. They're really quite extraordinary. Now, I want to close with this solid, and I love the title, that's an English title that he deliberately used, by Wang Dongling. And Wang Dongling, I think, presents this non-ideograph, if you want to call it that, as a state of emptiness, as a possibility of foregoing the obvious, as a possibility of going deeply inside what feeling is in art. How do we get to that state of feeling in art without a discourse? Okay? I think that's one of the biggest questions we have to ask today. Is it the possibility that we can discard the text and begin to feel? The Chinese have done it. Maybe we should begin looking in that direction. Thank you very much.